In 1965, the United States was reported to be deploying a significant force to Vietnam, featuring B-52 bombers, helicopters, and napalm, with the expectation that this overwhelming display of military might would quickly break the Viet Cong guerrillas. However, on the ground in Vietnam's dense jungles and swamps, American troops encountered a much harsher reality. The combat was described as grueling and relentless, with high casualties and frequent surprises for the Americans. By the summer of 1965, approximately 50,000 U.S. soldiers had arrived in South Vietnam as part of the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, MACV. The strategy outlined was to utilize American military strength to pressure North Vietnam into ceasing its support for the Viet Cong, who were destabilizing the South Vietnamese government. This approach was intentionally gradual and heavily reliant on air power. Prior to this, the U.S. had been secretly bombing North Vietnamese supply lines in Laos. In 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder escalated the bombing campaign, focusing on secondary targets rather than Hanoi itself, with the hope of encouraging North Vietnam to enter negotiations. President Lyndon B. Johnson's goal was not a traditional military victory, but rather to prevent North Vietnam from achieving victory in the South. North Vietnam, however, remained resolute, refusing to negotiate while foreign troops were present in South Vietnam. Consequently, it appeared that combat, rather than compromise, would continue to dominate the situation. U.S. General William Westmoreland was tasked with devising a strategy to drive the North out of South Vietnam without excessive use of U.S. resources or political capital. This was complicated by political constraints that limited ground operations to South Vietnam and by President Johnson's prohibition of a conventional invasion of North Vietnam due to fears of provoking Chinese intervention, as had occurred during the Korean War. Additionally, Johnson had banned attempts to disrupt the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Laos and Cambodia, making it challenging for Westmoreland to cut off supplies and isolate the battlefield. The American strategy debate came down to two main options: traditional combat operations or counterinsurgency efforts aimed at winning over the South Vietnamese population through smaller unit operations. While some advocated for counterinsurgency, Westmoreland was skeptical, believing it would require a larger troop commitment and risk giving the Viet Cong an advantage. Instead, he planned to exploit U.S. strengths in mobility and firepower to pursue a strategy of annihilation. Westmoreland's plan involved engaging the Viet Cong in large-scale battles to inflict severe casualties and prevent North Vietnam from sustaining the insurgency. This strategy focused on rapid attritional warfare, with U.S. troops conducting search and destroy missions rather than holding territory. The operations involved meticulously combing through houses and villages as they advanced northward. In one village, for example, the aim was to identify military-age men who might be Viet Cong. However, only women, children, and elderly men were observed. This marked a significant shift in the Department of Defense's strategy, with Secretary Robert McNamara's team adopting new statistical and quantitative methods borrowed from the business world to measure progress and predict when North Vietnam might reach a breaking point. Everything from the number of bombs dropped to the quantity of tent pegs used was tracked, but the primary metric remained the body count of North Vietnamese and Viet Cong casualties. Rather than measuring success by territory seized, the U.S. military focused on body counts as the primary gauge of progress, with the Pentagon pushing commanders to increase their kill and capture numbers to align with Westmoreland's strategy. This shift from a defensive to an offensive role involved actively seeking out and engaging the Viet Cong. The new strategy included search and destroy missions, where intelligence and reconnaissance were used to locate Viet Cong units and deploy ground forces to engage them. As the conflict intensified, U.S. troops called in airstrikes and artillery to deliver decisive blows. While similar tactics had been employed by the South Vietnamese Army, ARVM, American commanders believed that the quality of the South Vietnamese troops, not the tactics, was the issue. To enhance their effectiveness, U.S. forces were equipped with new gear and weapons starting in 1964. The Army transitioned from the 7.62mm M14 rifle to the 5.56mm M16, which, despite mixed reviews, was praised for its lighter weight and ease of use in close-quarters jungle combat. Troops also received the M60 machine gun and M79 grenade launchers to improve firepower against the less heavily armed Viet Cong. Radios became essential for coordinating support from fire bases or aircraft. Given South Vietnam's challenging terrain, traditional ground transport was often impractical. Instead, a brown water navy of patrol boats and hovercraft navigated rivers, while helicopters, particularly the O-1 Iroquois, Huey, revolutionized mobility. Hueys became crucial for troop insertions, extractions, medical evacuations, and resupply missions. During the Battle of Ia Drang in November 1965, air assault troops inflicted severe damage on North Vietnamese regulars who had entered from Cambodia. Despite fierce close-range combat, U.S. firepower, including B-52 bombers, repelled the attacks. Although many North Vietnamese forces escaped, the U.S. 1st Air Cavalry Division reported a significant 10-to-1 kill ratio, seeming to validate air assault tactics and Westmoreland's strategy. The psychological impact of helicopters was profound. North Vietnamese soldier Nguyen Quang Sang recalled the terror they inspired, reflecting on how the sight of helicopters was both frightening and haunting. By the end of 1965, the U.S. could claim that it had prevented the collapse of the South Vietnamese government and pushed the fight directly to the enemy. However, the Viet Cong quickly adapted and reverted to guerrilla tactics, informed by their understanding of the U.S. political landscape. North Vietnamese General Secretary Le Duan observed that while the U.S. could deploy a substantial number of troops, it was doing so gradually due to concerns about a prolonged conflict and growing opposition. This, he believed, gave the Viet Cong an advantage, allowing them to lead the fight in the south using tactics effective against the South Vietnamese Army, ARVN. In 1963, U.S. General Frank Osminski had described the harsh reality of Viet Cong tactics, which included non-explosive weapons, physical endurance, and resourcefulness. The Viet Cong used sniping, mines, and booby traps to inflict casualties and disrupt U.S. operations, targeting officers and radio operators to hinder air support. Their simplified logistics and extensive tunnel network provided significant advantages. Alongside the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, was making substantial progress. Through political organization, propaganda, and conscription, the NVA expanded its ranks and modernized its equipment with Soviet and Chinese support. The NVA's arsenal matched U.S. firepower, and the Soviet Union and China also provided anti-aircraft systems and advanced fighter jets, helping to shield North Vietnam from U.S. bombing. The North Vietnamese strategy relied on striking only when conditions were favorable, using patience and surprise to offset U.S. technological advantages. Despite the prominence of helicopters, the real combat in Vietnam was far from high-tech. As North Vietnamese forces became adept at downing helicopters and ambushing landing zones, the U.S. experienced significant losses. Helicopters were essential but costly, with many falling to enemy action. The U.S. military faced numerous challenges, including wildlife, disease, and exhaustion, while mines and booby traps posed significant hazards. The Viet Cong often initiated attacks, predicting the arrival of U.S. air support and withdrawing before it arrived or attacking so close that they risked friendly fire. By 1968, a substantial portion of U.S. casualties resulted from friendly fire. In entering villages, U.S. troops frequently faced sniper fire and ambushes, leading to frustration as the Viet Cong would vanish before troops could engage effectively. The jungle environment also posed challenges for U.S. weapons, particularly the M16 rifle, which experienced malfunctions due to its lightweight design and lack of prior training for many soldiers. The Pentagon responded with improvements to the M16, reducing its malfunction rate by 1968. Despite the rifle's mixed reputation, many troops valued its versatility and morale-boosting effect, especially when mounted on helicopters. The combination of combat stress, physical exhaustion, and relentless danger created significant frustration among U.S. troops. The unpredictable nature of the conflict meant that even after multiple uneventful patrols, an ambush could occur at any time. About a quarter of U.S. soldiers were draftees, many of whom were young and inexperienced. The high turnover of officers further complicated the situation. The intense pressures of combat, coupled with the elusive enemy and harsh environment, contributed to instances of American violence against Vietnamese civilians. As the war continued, civilian suffering increased due to violence from U.S., ARVN, and Allied forces, whether intentional or not. Hostility or indifference from locals led some U.S. jihadists to assume that villagers were Viet Cong supporters, a perception that, in some cases, was accurate. By 1967, the Vietnam War had reached a standstill. Despite high casualty rates inflicted on the enemy, the grueling nature of the conflict was taking its toll on U.S. troops. General Westmoreland's public optimism about progress and the number of U.S. troops in Vietnam were challenged by inflated figures and the rigid, numbers-driven approach to the war. The U.S. military's focus on body counts rather than traditional measures of success highlighted the complexities and shortcomings of their strategy in Vietnam.